welcome to another episode of Kids Cafe. It's your boy Max Chiwande. Kids Cafe is a podcast show that uplifts and promotes world-renowned pioneers, innovators, political enthusiasts, and etc. And today I have such an amazing guest with you, Dr. BUNTU SIWISA.
Thank you, Max, for having me. I'm really quite excited to be here.
No, thank you very much for also accepting the invite, sir. But before we start it off, I would like to read your profile, if you don't mind. So Dr. SIWISA is a senior lecturer in the Politics and International Relations Department at the University of Johannesburg. He authored 2 historical non-fictional books and a novel titled Rugby Resistance and Politics. Basically a story about how Qeqe shaped Port Elizabeth. And second historical non-fiction book is Umbhoxo, Making Rugby an Afrikan Game, and the novel being Paperless. Interesting one that we'll tap into that one. These works are all thought-provoking that include some of his other publications, peer-reviewed journals, and book chapters. He holds a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, as well as getting multiple degrees from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, ne?
Yes.
Okay. So Dr. SIWISA has a wealth of knowledge in academics, research, and conflict resolution, in particular emphasis on African governance and peace building.
Yes.
She's a profile. She's a profile. Among the many subjects he investigates the conflict studies, peace and security in Africa, and the contribution of BRICS and African development. This biography and history of sports liberation and urban growth and social movement. Yeah. So,
Yes.
where have you been? What have you been busy with?
Well, I've been busy with quite a number of things. Well, currently I'm teaching here at the University of Johannesburg, and so, with the exam season coming up, that can be quite preoccupying. Yeah?
Yes.
And so I suppose you're also interested in my research areas.
Yes.
So as you've pointed out, those are my research areas, and quite interestingly enough, I've also dabbled into all of these across professional backgrounds, that is academia, civil service, that is in government,
Civil society.
Yes. And these have given me quite a breathtaking panoramic view and perspectives on all of these areas that you've mentioned, governance, conflict resolution, conflict management, peace building. So I am here now at UJ, and I think in all of my career journeys, this will be the academic one. This will be really my mainstay and the last stretch, because I'm really quite enjoying it, dabbling into all of these genres and forms of writing, both non-fiction and fiction. And so this university gives you that
The edge to
the platform, the space, the edge also to delve into all of these. For instance, Paperless was shortlisted for the UJ Creative Writing Prize.
Yes. Wow.
Last year. Yeah? So it is in that sense when I say that the university UJ offers you that space to explore yourself optimally as both as a writer and as a researcher in all mediums of writing, fiction and non-fiction. So that's where I've been, and this is where I am now, and where I intend to move.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would really like to conduct this in I think I did say to you when off camera that I would really like to conduct this in a combination of conversations and also interviews. So I've set up a few questions that I'd really like you to answer if you don't
fine.
if you
I
don't mind. Okay, so I think I'm gonna just go straight into it. One of it, how did your time at Oxford shape your thinking about Africa's place in global politics?
Well, at that time, when I was in Oxford at the 10 of the 21st century, African studies and South African studies really were quite firmly established, but not firmly established as in now, because now in Oxford, I was in Oxford, I visited Oxford in 2022, and I've realized that the African Studies Center, unlike in my time 25 years ago, the African Studies Center has been mainstreamed and institutionalized. And unlike in my time, where African studies were really the type of studies that were regarded as area studies.
Oh, so they would make it a side, Africa Studies a side course.
Yeah,
I don't like that.
Side course, and that was really not mainstreamed in the sense that you'd really encounter studies on Africa, in particular in seminars and workshops, through your studies as a postgraduate student, but now it's been mainstreamed, But nonetheless, I mean, that was then a reflection of the time, and progress. A great deal of progress has been made in that sense. That now African Studies Center has been mainstreamed in its institutionalization, and also what was great about Oxford then was that really. One was exposed to this breathtaking platform of not only scholars but materials. You had all manner of materials, and the scholars who had written a lot of our texts and studies. I mean, you could see them, and they would come and they would interact with you, and that was really, really, really that was really quite great, and also you got a sense of how Africa was viewed from the global Northeast perspective, and you got a really from South Africa and in South Africa. One tends to think, particularly at that time when South Africa was 6 years old, as 6, 7, 8 years old, as an independent, a country that has achieved freedom and democracy. So one tended to see South Africa as really, really this very special country, and a very special country. But then now, from that perspective, you got to see South Africa properly from this international perspective that really sobered your perspective of where South Africa is, how South Africa is perceived in relation and in its context as part of the global South or the developing world.
Someone had mentioned to me that South Africa is the last born of Africa. Because I was wearing military clothing, and it's like, in my country, you get a beating. Okay, and so it makes me think, we are literally the last borns of Africa. And what are the thinkings of, you are based in when you're still studying in Oxford? What would they think about us?
Then or now?
I would like to say then and then now, maybe to see.
Well, at that time, as you've pointed out, we were quite new into freedom and democracy. Yeah. So, on the one hand, particularly from the global north, the British, the Europeans, they were quite excited about South Africa, and South Africa getting into the space as a free and democratic country, and Mandela and rainbowism and this democratic project, and at the same time, when you sit around with your fellow African students, they would warn you, fellow African students, about some of the post-colonial problems that South Africa is surely going
to face
and come across.
Wow.
Like corruption. And they will say, you're not special. You're getting there. You're not special.
Yes.
We're getting there. And of course, us as South Africans with that, no, it never
will be fine.
And they will say that, all of these infrastructural problems, institutional and governance problems that we experience as African countries, they come from these particular causes. And you, South Africa, you're not particularly immune from these.
True.
You wait, your time is coming. So you got these perspectives. Some sobering, others really still coddling us as this new baby that has been welcomed into freedom and democracy. So this is what we experience. And when you think back now, it's actually quite interesting to see that some of those post-colonial problems that we've been warned about have indeed taken place. And that now global northern countries who really thought of us as this special kid, new baby that has gone into freedom and democracy. Now we are just another panel, another African country. There's nothing special with us.
I'm low-key angry at maybe the peers that were in your time. Why didn't you, since those guys were foreseeing it, why couldn't you guys, as the leaders of Azania, make a plan for us?
Really at that time, and I remember that former President Thabo Mbeki used to warn us again and again that we used to call it political careerism.
Please elaborate more.
Careful of political careerism, should be careful of corruption, it's seeping in. But I think at that time things were so good economically.
Yeah, so you didn't.
They were so good economically, politically. We just couldn't imagine ourselves. And so those warnings, they were like, no, really. You'd think about them for 5 minutes, and then after that, completely forget about them because they were so far from the reality,
that you
and
couldn't
everything was well oiled and good, and so and in many ways it really caught us by surprise. Was the slide into maladministration, corruption was so swift. And so it really caught us by surprise. That we're here now.
Okay. So the second question is challenges you've encountered while working on the foreign relations in Southern African countries. As we know that you've worked with some really interesting countries, Zimbabwe, Mr. Ghana. Is it Namibia?
Well, I've worked really. When I used to work for government, my focus was really on Southern Africa, and my focus was also particularly on Zimbabwe. So our focus then was on the democratization process, number one, conflict resolution, conflict resolution between opposition political parties and incumbent political parties in order to create a kind of nation building, social cohesion as a way of mitigating conflict. So one of the things that really bothered us and that I observed was that this sense of stubbornness. You could see
where we're getting the stubbornness.
This sense of stubbornness from sitting governing ruling parties or governing parties, and what I realized, what I've really truly learned is that when you try to reform institutions, most of the incumbent governments would protect and try and shield any form of reformation on electoral institutions, because electoral institutions, they sit at the core of ensuring that the governing party stays on for whatever period of time they desire to. This is reflected in Zimbabwe. This is also reflected in Mozambique. What we've just experienced in Mozambique. The reason why there are these protests. No. What we've experienced, the post-election crisis. What we've experienced in Mozambique is that the ruling party has been stealing stealing elections consistently since 1999, both national and electoral. And the reason why they've been successful in stealing elections is because
Like the biggest diamond found here in the world was from Lamsawa or Mara. It's Queen Elizabeth's.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. So
Yes.
So they protect the electoral institutions
Mm.
to ensure that they stay in power. The same as in Zimbabwe. That is how the sitting ruling government. This is what I've learned and I've picked up. Whenever you try to ensure that you have communication, you have negotiation between the opposition, civil society, and the governing party.
Mm.
And you are looking at democratization process. Look at reforms at the electoral institutions. If you unlock that, you'll be able to democratize the country. Now, the reason why, even after the unity government in Zimbabwe, we haven't been able to democratize is because the incumbent government has been able to protect and resist reforms on the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission. Equally so, the Mozambican government will resist reforms on its electoral institutions to ensure that it stays in power. Now, this is what I've really, if you manage to unlock that.
But who becomes the person that needs to hand us the key? Who becomes the custodians of making the gates open that for us to actually achieve that?
I think also these regional economic communities, SADC, should really have a stronger hand. And SADC really being this not really strong and decisive and in its decisions and in its application of pressure on political reforms. These are the guys who hold the keys. Because if you look in West Africa, ECOWAS in South Africa is quite the opposite in its decisiveness.
Yes.
That is why you've had quite a number of success stories in West Africa. Gambia.
Would you consider
because that regional economic community, unlike SADC, held the key to key economic and political reformations? And I think SADC has been so weak to the point that we've had quite a number of crises in Southern Africa that SADC has failed to intervene in Zimbabwe, in Madagascar, in Lesotho, you name them, and they always come with this very neutral, indecisive statement. So those are the guys who hold the keys
okay.
to our transformation process, the regional economic communities.
Okay. So looking at your specialized work on BRICS in relations to peace and development, what role do you think the BRICS should play in shaping Southern African countries?
Well, BRICS really has a lot of potential. BRICS is really divided into 3 layers. Into 3 layers. This is the way that it works. So the first layer is the ministerial and presidential level. And so
what's it? Does it become executive?
Okay. These are the guys who take executive decisions. These are the guys who take executive decisions that are really drawn also from these communiques of SADC, of BRICS. And so that's the first layer. And then the second layer is the academic, what we call the academic forum and the experts forum. Now this is the level that takes whatever mandate from the first layer, research about it, come up with recommendations. And then the third layer is what they call civil society and people to people.
Legislative.
No, people to people. So these are the civil society,
Jeez.
people of different BRICS countries meeting up, whether through cultural activities,
jeez.
writing, etc. Now the problem really with BRICS is that these two, they are disconnected. So as much as this second layer is supposed to feed information onto the first layer, it does not do so, because the first layer doesn't really
Reflect much.
take much or listen to it much, because of its own
Agenda.
national priorities
Jeez.
and agenda. So there are these disconnections, and if these connections would then work, like a lot of developmental problems and challenges in Africa would be resolved, because each of the BRICS countries has a developmental, what do they call them? A developmental arm.
Okay.
Like
okay.
in South Africa, we have the South African Development
Development
Partnership, SADPA.
SADPA. I'm thinking about
Southern African Development Partnership,
Okay.
and then all of them. So, but they work in silos. So they don't work.
And where does the National Development Act play in part with that?
Well, the national, it's not really. This is not really national. It used to be called the Renaissance Fund. During Thabo Mbeki's fund.
Okay.
Thabo Mbeki's time. So this is the fund that would go into funding activities as reflected or as prioritized by our foreign policy in Southern Africa and in Africa, whether we have to help a country that is experiencing war, displacement of people,
families,
etc.
Okay.
So all of these BRIC countries have this kind of but they work in silos, and so as a result, the effects on Africa and African development are not as are not optimally reflected as much as they could if they were working together.
Okay. No, so I think on that one, I think we could even have the whole day if we must not cool managing politics. What I would really like to move into is getting into your books now.
Okay.
The first one, I will even say to you till now, it's Rugby, Resistance and Politics by Buntu Siwisa. A story of how Qeqe helped shape the history of Port Elizabeth. Tell me about this book, sir.
This book really it has a very interesting story on how it came about.
Mm-hmm.
So this book came out of the first African Biographies project.
Yes.
Of the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced
Studies. Oh yes.
So
you're actually the senior lecturer for the Johannesburg.
No, but at that time,
I mean, senior researcher.
But that time, I hadn't really, I hadn't been roped in. And
Oh,
working for
okay.
UJ at that time. So the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study had this project. So the objective of the project was to gather academics, gather some researchers, to profile and write biographies on various South Africans who have contributed across disciplines, across disciplines, who have influenced and contributed to South Africa to where it is now, to this post-apartheid democratic dispensation. So you could write about someone who played a huge role in sports, in politics, in music, culture, etc., etc. So in my conversation with the former director of GIAS then, Professor Bongani Ngqulunga, he was amazed. He said that, who is this guy? What kind of a person what kind of a black man has a stadium named, a living black man has a stadium named after himself at the height of apartheid. That doesn't make sense. He's not dead. He's living.
He's living that time. It's not like a memorial stadium.
It just doesn't make sense. Why don't you write about him? And then I realized that, Qeqe is really so famous, so popular in Port Elizabeth, and yet there's almost nothing written about him. When I ventured into research on him, I realized that there were about not more than 20 internet hits on Qeqe, not more than 20. And so I thought, well, this is actually quite interesting. I'm also from Port Elizabeth. I grew up and I knew
He was friends with your grandfather.
With my grandfather in the KwaZulu-Natal Rugby Union.
Yes.
Kwaru. Because a lot of people tend to want to write about these big national political heroes that have been well written about. And so everyone wants to cluster and write about
the same ideologies.
Nelson
Mandela, Steve
Biko, Steve Biko, and not realize that what makes national histories are also local histories.
Yes. I think that's what births national stories.
Precisely, So a lot of people, they tend to be seduced by these national histories to the point of neglecting local histories. And it's local histories that bring us the texture and the nuances of South African history that fill up all of these spaces about South African history. So then that's how I wrote Qeqe. And when I went into fieldwork research in 2019, I gathered so much material. So much material on non-racial sports history, interviews on Qeqe, archival material. It was really, really quite an enriching process. And when I sat down to write the first draft during COVID, I remember that because I had so much material, both secondary, primary, archival material, and oral material interviews. For every chapter, I would spend a day, just a day, sometimes a day to 2 days, before writing a chapter, organizing all the material from the heap of materials that I had, and taking out and saying, no, this is for chapter 3. I'm writing chapter 3 now, and that would take me the entire day, just because of the richness in both quantity and quality of the material, So I would spend a day just going back to my library and picking up all of these different types of materials to use to write that chapter. And then I would sit down and write the chapter for 3 weeks. So it was a truly, truly enriching experience, and this is the book that really marked me, in a sense, in that a lot of people recognize me for this book more than any other book. This book, because it really brought out a lot.
Yes.
Not just on Qeqe, because not just on Qeqe as a hero, but on Qeqe as a complex character, both as a hero and a villain. A complex
seems like a bully, though.
A complex character that comes out of a complex history, because some of our history is really quite complex, because people tend to think that when you write about political history, you have to have villains and heroes, and villains are white and heroes are black. And it wasn't like that at all. And even when I went into the research, there was a time when I thought I wanted it to be like that, but the material just reflected otherwise. No, it's far too complicated than that.
Because I'm getting that you was also making relationships with the opponents, the opponents of non-racial sports.
Well, as I said, Qeqe was quite a complex character coming out of, complex political times. So, as much as he was a hero, he developed non-racial black rugby, developed non-racial cricket, built schools for black children, started high schools, and opposed racism, opposed racist institutions. But he was also quite controversially, part of building a homeland system in Siskai, in 1973.
So he was a wealthy man, this man.
He was part of that, building
We
a
taught up,
homeland
mad.
system that was quite counter-revolutionary. He came from a wealthy family.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, makes sense.
And also he had been, I think, for 14 years, been a member of the New Brighton Native Advisory Board.
Yes.
Which could be or was regarded as a stooge body for Africans,
Yeah.
So he was complex in that sense, and he wasn't the only one who played these roles that were quite dualistic. Number one, that were contradictory. Yeah, quite a number of people did that. So you didn't really have a villain hero, and even the people who were reflected as villains in local histories, in local rugby non-racial sports hero, like for instance this other main character here, who was the main administrator for the Port Elizabeth African Rugby Board.
Under EPUB.
Usingapi. Because, quite interestingly, when I was doing my research, the way Singapi came out of, he really was this bad character, who acted alongside white apartheid institutions. But when you really dig deep, he wasn't.
He wasn't.
He was not a villain. Well, he may have had his characters that also made him not a particularly likable character.
Yeah.
As much as Qeqe also appeared as a bully.
The bully.
But he was not a stooge, So when you really get into it, you really get into a kind of a revisionist history where you turn things upside down. From your research, your research tells you that it's not black and white.
Yeah.
The story is not black and
white.
But the story is black, white, purple, and pink.
Pink, all
All
together.
mixed up, Yeah.
Okay. Did you encounter any resistance or discomfort in uncovering and presenting the more questionable aspects of Qeqe's power bases?
Well, a couple of things coming out was that it's very interesting how Qeqe was he's a very popular character. He's part of the architecture of Port Elizabeth. He's part of the history, really,
the people's biography
of Port Elizabeth. But at the same time, it's very interesting how history, the way it's documented, and how oral history will give you back a type of history that you don't like. Will give you back, throw you back a type of history that you find you yourself as a writer, you find not quite happy at the beginning to embrace it. Yeah, but now this was a very, very interesting learning curve for me, because I also came into this exercise with a view of Qeqe, of this character, this very popular character, and particularly through my first fieldwork. I had 2 fieldwork trips between March and April 2019 and October and November 2019, and so the kind of character that Qeqe came out, it was a very complex character, complex but human character, and the complexity of his character was also a reflection of his background, a reflection of his time, because Qeqe came from
Humble beginnings.
not humble. He came from a wealthy background, and coming from not just a wealthy background, but a background that also had historically served as a kind of counselor for a particular chief in Port Elizabeth that was close to the Ciskei and the formation of the Ciskei government, which was quite reactionary, So as I've pointed out, then Qeqe came out in the history also as having served in the New Brighton Native Advisory Report. So when I looked at it, I thought, but this is quite complex. And then I realized that this complexity is not just him. Quite a number of people, if you look at the names of the streets in New Brighton Township, and you look at all of the names, you'd find that 98% of those streets were members of the New Brighton Native Advisory Board, which was regarded as a dummy body, a dummy apartheid body. But these people were not as much as they were regarded as stooges of the apartheid government, but they did not entirely act as stooges. They had a sense of independence and a sense of exploiting the same institutions for their own people's development. And so these are the complexities that you find in history, and you can't distort them. So these are the things that I learned. And some of the resistance really were that it was quite interesting because there were two main rugby clubs in Underquarry. You had Spring Rose and the Whites, the Union Rugby Board. And both of these carried different types of histories of Qeqe. One was, Spring Rose was pro-Qeqe, and the other one was anti. And you had to merge the two and pick up what's true and what's not true. But it was only in merging the two that you get a complete picture of who Qeqe was and what Port Elizabeth was, and how Port Elizabeth molded Qeqe, and how Qeqe was molded by PE. And so you did, and then eventually you realize that this is history. It's messy. There's no good or bad. It's just messy. Yeah. So it's very interesting that
and very thought-provoking. I thank you for writing this book, especially for someone that's I'm a rugby player myself. Play for the institution of UJ. I played for Lions, and it's quite also saddening that I remember in high school I went to a tournament called Craven Week. I'm sure you should know the tournament that was started by Danny Craven, an ex-Springbok player. And I think on the side of black consciousness or black identity, we needed a tournament like a Qeqe week.
Yeah, no, we do. Because as I've reflected in the book,
nationally, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a 10 and Rose Qeqe Foundation.
Yes, that I'm aware. Oh, yes. So maybe I need to do more of my research.
And this book, it reflects that, black South Africans have been playing rugby
for more
before Afrikaners did. They've been playing rugby since 1820, black people.
Yeah.
And rugby started in the Port Elizabeth, Grahamstown,
Harbour.
Beltway. It started there. So the first clubs between 1887 and before 1920, they were formed exclusively in that beltway between Port Elizabeth and Grahamstown before moving on to East London. 1924 moving on to Gauteng. Only 1924. Yeah.
Okay.
And the Boers, also through a process of observation, they only learnt of rugby between 1899 and 1902.
You mentioned that
when they were prisoners of
war.
Po.
Yeah, Po.
As a consequence of the South African War, or the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 19. So they observed rugby as prisoners of war in all of these outposts that were controlled by the British, in St. Helena, in what we now call in Ceylon, what we now call Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So they observed this as much as black people observed rugby playing from the English engineers who had who were in Port Elizabeth to build the harbour. Yeah? As much as black miners had observed British soldiers marching outside of the mines, hence gumboots dancing. So a lot of these processes came through assimilation and observation. Yeah. So this is what it teaches us, and it's still quite a campaign to convince people and to tell people that rugby is not a white sport.
Yeah, no. I was also in denial of
that. This is what we're trying to do with Umbhoxo, to tell people that rugby is not a white sport.
So I think this book, so these two books would, I would say, go hand in hand, né?
It is as much a black sport as it is cherished by Afrikaners and other racial groups in South Africa. In that, and it's very interesting how rugby had been indigenized.
Yes,
in townships through churches.
Yes, you did. Yes, they served as pillars.
So you'd find, for instance, that one of the earliest clubs here, the Easterns, they adopted red and white, which were colors of the Methodist Church.
Okay.
Spring Rose adopted colors which were colors of the Ethiopian Church. And so on and so on and so on. And this is how rugby became then really indigenized in the sense that these churches gave rugby a black face, and gave rugby this acceptance as a black sport.
Yeah, we spent so much time on this book.
Yeah.
The next book I would really like us to, since we don't have much time and there's a better two topics that I would really like us to do. So I'll give you just a few questions on Paperless. Paperless is another book you wrote 2023.
Well, I actually wrote that book. Yeah.
Yes. So you wrote this, but the manuscript of this was made around 2005?
Yeah, the manuscript, I wrote this between 2000 and 2005 while I was doing my PhD.
Yes. You would carry it around PTA.
Yeah, because it's really a reflection of my experiences of seeing a white Oxford, black Oxford, and an illegal Oxford.
Aish. How do you become an illegal Oxford? How are you in the institution?
Illegal. Oxford is a city.
Oh, it's a city.
Oxford is a city.
Oh, I thought yeah.
Because, Oxford, unlike Cambridge in the UK, has this strong industrial base. So they have a motor manufacturing plant and other plants, unlike Cambridge. And as a result,
a lot of people from
it attracted quite a lot of, there's a big working class community in Oxford, unlike in Cambridge. And that working class community is divided by a roundabout. Now this roundabout is it divides Cowley Road and the High Street. Yeah.
Okay.
And so as a result of that, it also equally attracts a lot of immigrant communities, workerist communities and immigrant communities. Whether they are there legally and illegally because of this industrial base. So, and I was so surprised because I was so surprised to see this big black South African community
that was there.
Yeah, that was there because you always think of other African nationalities that travel, that are immigrants, not black South Africans. Yeah. So I observed this and I observed them, all of the pressures that they faced and all of the struggles that they faced, and I thought this is really I should record this.
Okay.
And record this not in any other form of...
It's not academic, no?
You see, the role of the novel...
Yeah.
The role of non-fiction is to record history and to record and analyze political, social, cultural phenomena. But if you want to add emotions that accompany and fully explain a particular political phenomenon, you
psychological.
write that in a novel. You write that in a play, you write that in a short story, but you write it in fiction form to try and now create a full story of the immigrant experience.
Okay.
And I thought, this won't do if I write a non-fiction book. This one, I have to express those emotions.
Okay.
That's how then it came about.
So I'm not gonna really. I had prepared about 15 questions. I don't
Yeah.
think we'll go over them, and
Yeah,
I will go over them off camera.
That's fine.
Yes. Luzuko Koba, a South African student at Oxford, is the main character that you write about. He inhabits a life of undocumented lives. What drew you center to this narrative around dual existence?
Well, as I've pointed out, really, is that I was really intrigued that from Oxford is usually portrayed in mainstream literature, in mainstream media, as this academic city. With these, that is Oxford. It's mainstream. You have all of these white males and white females, mainstream. And when I got there, I realized that it's not like that at all. You have white Oxford, you have black Oxford, and you have
African
illegal.
Let me
A
say.
lot of illegal immigrants, particularly during that time, and there were a lot of deportations. And at that time, it was the time of Tony Blair.
Tony Blair, yes.
Yeah. So I thought that this is very, very interesting. This is not the kind of Oxford that you
Come across.
Yeah, and there were only 2 works of fiction that I realized were written by Africans talking about Oxford. One was written by a Zimbabwean, Dambutso Marachel, but this was in short story forms.
Okay.
You'd find a couple of short stories, Black Skin, White Mask.
By Francis Fanon.
No, Dambutso Marachel.
Black Skin.
It's a short story. In his, he says, it doesn't say, it's not white mask, it's what mask.
Oh,
It's
white
black skin.
mask. We
You
need to check out
it's a
that
short
book.
story. It's a short story in his novella, and in his collection of short stories titled House of Hunger, The House of Hunger. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is one, and then there's another one, novel by Sarah Latipa Manyika. Half of that novel is based in Oxford, but this was a historical drama, 50s and 60s. So so I thought that I should add to this, number one, and give a revisionist outlook, a different outlook portrait of what Oxford truly is, and that what Oxford is for black people. Because even it's not really that the kind of black experience or black lived experiences that you have in Oxford is not what you perceive. So you don't have this big black united communities. It's quite fragmented. Because it's multinational, it's fragmented. Even the black South African communities that I found there, they were not really united because of various factors. So I thought that it is my duty to respond and write this. And I thought that also South African literature does not have émigré, what we call émigré literature. You have quite a lot of that in Nigerian literature, in Zimbabwean literature when they write about. But I thought we don't have that.
I'm sure we are too comfortable with not leaving the country.
Yeah. so I thought, let me be the first one to do this and reflect to people that we do, South Africans, we do travel. South Africans do travel.
For Asia, not to us. Not to us.
Yeah.
Because when you look at countries like Ghana, Zimbabwe, those guys will literally go with their last money. They don't even know where they're going to sleep, whatever. Where knows if you come back, flight you come So tapping into my next question, how much of Luzuko's emotional journey is inspired by your work, experiences, or observations?
Well, it's a very interesting question. They tend to ask that of a lot of writers. It's like asking a spider.
Why yes?
It's like asking a spider where its web comes from. Does it come from its body, or does it come from the environment? So So it's quite It's quite inspired by the experiences that I had, but more importantly, the times. Because Oxford is different now. The last time I went to Oxford in 2022, I was so surprised by the peace and order and tranquility.
That place had bring.
I didn't see one police car.
Namang.
But when I was there during my time, you always saw police cars all over the place, but I didn't see one. And I thought this is quite strange. So it's quite important to note with Paperless that more importantly is also a reflection of that particular period.
No, man. So I really wish I have to make another sit down with you to further go in depth with these books. But what I really like to tap into, like quick 2 minutes, is academic questions, and I hope you would really chop them up for me quickly.
Quickly.
So the first one, we are learning about African political thoughts in class. It covers ranges like decoloniality, post-colonialism, the ecology of poverty and precarity of black households. What is important of this synthesis of policy and lived experiences? Just quick, so
synthesis. So what's really important is that students, particularly in answering and tackling questions,
yes,
through intersectional analysis, is that a lot of students, they tend to either get carried away and write or answer questions without relating or making references to the question.
Yes.
And so they lose a lot.
We becoming tangent talkers
because you see one area that you know about and you get carried away and you write a lot about it without referring it to the question. And so much of what you write about is not anchored on the question, and so you do not answer the question and you lose about 10 to 15 marks. As a result of that, and secondly is that students, they tend to write more of their opinions out of the context of the recommended readings, out of the context of what's reflected in the readings, which is a reflection that students, they don't really go into the readings, and that also costs quite a lot, because you can tell that these are opinions, and these opinions are out of context.
So you mentioned that we hardly consult. To me, students, we don't consult. And when we do start consulting, what kind of conversations do you think we should bring to your office?
When students really consult, they are really more concerned about passing,
not understanding.
So they really consult right at the edge of
pass or fail,
test, an assessment, or exam.
So it becomes hard.
So and you find that they just want to pass. They are not really concerned about understanding. So there's this sense of lack of enthusiasm, really, among a majority of students about their courses. I think this is partly reflected by the poor attendance, which is really, really quite a pity, because that is also reflected in the quality of the performance of students in their tests. You can see that the student has not been attending, and a lot of students, as I've pointed out before, they don't spend time going into the readings. They don't, and that is reflected. You can't run away from that. That is reflected in your performance. So spend time doing your readings and reflect on the questions first. So when you are writing a test or an exam, spend about 10 minutes reading the questions, ensuring that you understand them, ensuring that you interpret them well. Underline the key words. That is the part of interpreting the question that will help you in distilling the question. Because if you don't do that, you run the risk of losing about 10 to 15 marks, you know. And that really is a difference between barely passing and a 70.
Okay.
You know?
The course encourages independent thinking and critical thinking. How do you think you can define that in your teaching philosophy, and how can students cultivate it in this university?
Yeah, I think students are used to rote learning. I think
Please elaborate what's rote learning?
Rote learning is regurgitating verbatim, word for word.
Oh, okay.
What
okay.
you've learned.
Oh.
You know? And so students are not used to intersectional analysis. Taking what they've learned, the theory, applying it to political phenomena, you know. So using the theory, applying it to political phenomena, and using other forms of readings, and think about these. Because students, they think that the world will come to you and say, summarize, give me what did Nkrumah say about this. No one's going to ask you about that.
And that's what we're expecting when you're making us read both Steve Biko.
No one is going to ask you, you know. You know, no one's going to say, write an article. Someone will say, how do you interpret this? Then you use your own discretion to use your background of understanding of theories and understanding of the political phenomena and what these theories say about these phenomena.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then last question I would like to. So I made you aware that in this politics class that I'm with you, most of the students that are in that class, we are coming from the advanced group. So basically what that means is that we didn't have as much classes as the people that were that are at APK Studio. How can you prepare for your exams, sir?
But what I've realized is that in terms of quality, the quality of these students
from
and
advanced and
yet
who's
APK
who's
is
better?
Similar. It's really similar. There's no so I don't understand where this anxiety comes from, because it's really quite similar.
This book specifically, I would like to go give it to my rugby coach, and maybe one day host you at my rugby at the rugby, so you can have a talk with the rugby boys, man.
Okay, sure.
And otherwise, thank you very much, thanks, don't forget to follow the podcast, and please come and consult leaders. Please come consult, because also consult. Thank you.